Welcome at the YouTube channel Beat Insomnia. Let's go back. Way back, not 100 years, not 500 years, we're talking thousands of years ago, long before highways, skyscrapers, and smartphones, long before the United States was even a thought in anyone's mind. This land, it was something else entirely. Wild. Enormous. Alive.so. Picture this, you wake up one morning under a sky so blue it almost hurts your eyes. There are no fences, no buzzing lights, no traffic jams. Just forests stretching forever, rivers sparkling in the sun, and a silence so deep it feels sacred. Sounds peaceful, right? But surviving here? Oh, that's a whole different story. Before any Europeans set foot here, what we now call North America was home to over 600 distinct native nations. Yeah, you read that right, 600. Each one with its own language, culture, belief system, and way of life. Forget the old stereotype of everyone living in teepees. That's just one version of the story. Out west, you had the Chumash building ocean-going canoes. In the southeast, the Mississippians were constructing massive earth pyramids, and up north, the Haudenosaunee, you might have heard them called the Iroquois, had a political system so advanced, it inspired parts of the U.S. Constitution. Ever heard that in school? Probably not. Alright, let's talk landscape. From the icy Arctic Circle to the tropical swamps of Florida, native peoples adapted to everything. They didn't just survive nature, they understood it, they respected it, they worked with it. Need a home in the forest? Birch bark and sap. Need to cross a river? Build a dugout canoe. Need food in winter? Smoke and dry it in summer. They didn't have apps or delivery services, they had observation, tradition, and serious skills passed down through generations. And hey, no Google Maps either. Just starlight and stories. Now here's something cool, there were no state lines. No passports. The land itself was the guide. Buffalo roamed the Great Plains in herds so big they made the ground shake, deer tiptoed through eastern forests, and salmon filled the rivers of the Pacific Northwest so thick, it was said you could walk across their backs. You won't believe this, but some tribes timed their movements with the animals. They knew when the birds would migrate, when the berries would ripen, and when it was time to move camp. Can you imagine knowing the land so well? It's like it whispers to you. Here's what I think a lot of folks miss. Indigenous America wasn't one culture. It was a vibrant mosaic of cultures, beliefs, and ideas. Some tribes followed the herds. Others grew maize, beans, and squash in tidy rows. Some lived in massive pueblos made of stone and clay. Others in bark-covered longhouses that held whole families, and they didn't all get along either. There were wars, alliances, diplomacy, trade networks stretching from Canada to Mexico. Shells from the Atlantic coast made it all the way to the Rocky Mountains. Copper from the Great Lakes ended up in temples far to the south. Pretty impressive, huh? Surviving here wasn't about hoarding stuff or building walls. It was about balance. You took what you needed, you gave thanks, and you gave back, through rituals, offerings, and stories that reminded you the earth wasn't something you owned. It was something you belonged to. Think about that for a second. Living in a world where every rock, tree, and breeze meant something, where the animals weren't just food, they were teachers. A bear might teach courage. An owl, wisdom. A coyote, mischief. Because every culture needs a prankster. Now, it wasn't paradise. Nature could be harsh. One bad season could mean hunger. One wrong move in the wild could mean you became the hunted. But the people here had figured something out. A way to live in sync with a wild, beautiful, and often unforgiving land. They had medicine people, they had storytellers, they had rules and rituals for everything, from planting corn to naming babies. So when we say untouched land, we don't mean emptied, we mean full of life, knowledge, and deeply rooted wisdom. So yeah, long before the Pilgrims, before Columbus, before anyone discovered anything, people were already here, thriving, struggling, growing, living. And as we journey deeper into this series, we'll follow them, not just as footnotes in someone else's history, but as human beings figuring out how to survive, adapt, and pass down their knowledge in one of the most challenging and breathtaking environments on Earth. You're out in the woods. No cell phone. No snacks. No GPS. Just you, the wind in the trees, and the sun sliding behind the hills. Now what? That's kind of what life was like for the first people living on this land, except they were ready for it. They didn't just survive in nature. They thrived in it. They knew the land like we know our streets or favorite apps. And that kind of survival? It didn't come easy. It was earned, passed down, and practiced every single day. So, how did they do it? Let's walk a mile in their moccasins. Imagine waking up with the sunrise. The air is crisp, the ground still damp with morning dew. No alarm clocks, just birds, the smell of smoke from last night's fire, and the low hum of people getting to work. Because surviving out here? It was an all-day, everyday kind of thing. Your day might start with hunting. But this isn't some action movie where someone charges through the forest with a spear. No, this takes patience. You'd be moving slow, barely breathing, tracking footprints through mud, noticing broken twigs or fur caught on bark. You're looking for clues. Every leaf and sound tells a story. Maybe it's deer. Maybe it's rabbit. Maybe, if you're really unlucky, it's you being followed. Now, you're not alone. You've got people with you. Maybe your uncle, who's been teaching you since you were old enough to walk how to move quietly, how to read the wind, how to respect the animal you're chasing. And that's important, respect. You don't just kill for fun. You do it with care. With purpose. You thank the animal's spirit. You use every part of it, meat, bones, hide, even the sinew for thread. If you're not hunting, maybe you're fishing. Ever tried catching a fish without a rod? Welcome to the real deal. You'd be using woven nets, sharpened spears, maybe even fish traps made from rocks or sticks. And forget plastic buckets. You're carrying your catch in baskets you wove yourself. Speaking of baskets, crafting those? It's a whole art form. People could weave waterproof ones from tree bark or grasses. Some were so tightly made they could hold soup. Soup! In a basket. Can you imagine that? Now, depending on where you are, your survival toolkit changes. If you're in the Southwest, you're dealing with heat and dryness. So you'd be learning to store water, build homes out of adobe that keep cool during the day and warm at night. You'd be growing corn, beans, and squash, called the Three Sisters. They grow perfectly together. One gives support, one adds nitrogen to the soil, the third covers the ground and keeps weeds out. Smart, right? But if you're up north, it's a different game. Freezing winters, heavy snow, short growing seasons. So you learn to preserve food, smoking, drying, fermenting. You build shelters insulated with moss, hides, snow. You wear layers made from animal skins, carefully stitched with bone needles. And let's not forget fire. It's not just for staying warm. It's your stove, your light, your protection. But lighting one isn't as easy as striking a match. You'd be using flint and steel, or rubbing sticks together until they smoke. Then you feed it carefully, patiently, until it catches. People knew which trees burned best, which ones smoked too much, which woods worked for cooking and which for keeping bugs away. Fire was a living thing you had to tend. Let it go out in the middle of winter. That's trouble. Now, let's say you're not hunting or building. You're gathering. And this, believe it or not, might be even trickier. Why? Because some plants are food. Others are poison. And they look the same. One berry could heal you. Another could knock you out, or worst, that's where knowledge comes in. You learn from your parents, your grandparents, and your elders. They don't hand you a textbook. They show you. They take you. They make you taste the sweet, smell the bitter, feel the textures of bark and leaf. It's hands-on, trial by fire, and totally unforgettable. And medicine? It's all around you. Willow bark for pain. Yarrow for cuts. Sage for cleansing. But it's not just about the herbs. There's ceremony. Belief. Spirit. A medicine person might use chants, smoke, and songs along with the roots and powders. Healing was physical and spiritual at the same time. So yeah, survival meant knowing your environment, but also your culture. What you ate, what you wore, how you built your home, how you raised your kids, it was all part of a larger rhythm. Speaking of homes, get this, not every native home was a teepee. That's just one style, mostly from the plains. In the forests, you'd find longhouses, massive wooden structures holding entire families. In the desert, you'd see pueblos made of stone and mud. Along the Mississippi River, there were even mound cities with homes built on top. Each house matched the land, the weather, and the lifestyle of the people who built it. Lightweight for nomads. Heavy and permanent for farmers. Every detail had a reason, and inside those homes, life kept buzzing. People made clothes by hand, spinning fibers, tanning hides, decorating with beads and shells. They made tools from bones, antlers, stones. Every item had a maker, a history, a story. Let's not forget about food again, because wow, there was a lot of creativity. Cornbread cooked on hot stones. Stews bubbling in clay pots. Maple syrup tapped straight from trees. Wild rice harvested by canoe. And if you're lucky, maybe you catch a feast day. Music, dancing, roasted meat, laughter around the fire. It's survival, but it's also celebration, and here's the thing, survival wasn't just about the body. It was about the mind and spirit too. People told stories, lots of them. Around fires, at bedtime, during ceremonies. These stories taught you about your ancestors, your values, your place in the world. They weren't just fairy tales. They were survival guides. You'd learn which animal to follow, which mountain to avoid, how to find the stars when you're lost. One story might teach courage. Another might warn you against greed. All of them had layers, lessons tucked in between magic and myth, and the more you listened, the more you understood not just the land, but your place in it. Now, survival also meant working together. No one did this alone. Everyone had a role. Children learned by watching. Elders guided. Women often gathered and prepared food, managed medicine, and cared for the community. Men hunted, protected, built. But these roles weren't fixed. There was flexibility, especially when survival demanded it, and get this, some communities had two-spirit people. That means someone who didn't fit into the usual male or female roles but was respected as someone holding both. They were often seen as gifted, balanced, and wise. Imagine that kind of understanding and respect back then. Of course, there were rules. Social codes. You couldn't just do whatever you wanted. Disrespecting nature? Big no. Acting selfishly? Also no. Because in this world, your survival depended on everyone else doing their part. You shared food. You helped raise each other's kids. You took care of the elders. You didn't leave anyone behind, because out there, in the wild, you might be next, and when things got hard, and they did get hard, people turned to ceremony. To drums, to dances, to prayers whispered in smoke. These weren't empty rituals. They brought people together. They gave strength when there was none left. Can you imagine standing in the cold, around a fire, hands joined, voices rising into the night sky, praying for a successful hunt, for rain, for healing? That's what survival looked like. So yeah, no Wi-Fi. No refrigerators. No running water, but there was knowledge. Wisdom. Heart, and a connection to the land that ran deeper than we can probably understand today. You weren't surviving against nature, you were surviving with it. Listening to it. Learning from it. Living by its rules, and if you messed up, nature reminded you. Now, you might be wondering, could you do it? Could you walk into that world and last a week, a month, a year? Well, maybe. But only if you listened, only if you respected the land, the people, the ways, because in this world, survival wasn't just about being tough, it was about being wise. And next up, we're about to see how that wisdom shaped entire nations, some peaceful, some fierce, all deeply rooted in the balance of power. Okay, so by now, you've probably realized surviving in the ancient Americas wasn't a one-person gig. It was teamwork, it was spiritual, and, let's be honest, it was impressive. But survival was only the start. People didn't just live, they built societies, systems, civilizations. Yep, that's right. When we picture native life before colonization, we've got to go beyond teepees and campfires. There were nations here. Governments. Councils. Laws. And they weren't chaotic or random, they were structured, thoughtful, and sometimes more democratic than European monarchies at the time. Let's dig into how power worked in this wild, beautiful, pre-colonial land. So, here's the thing. Not every group of people functioned the same way. You had over 500 distinct tribal nations, each with their own language, customs, and leadership styles. That's a lot of variety. But there were common threads. And one of the biggest? Consensus. Yep, consensus. That meant leaders didn't just bark orders. They listened. Decisions, especially the big ones, were made with lots of discussion. Councils were formed, and everyone got a voice: elders, warriors, mothers, sometimes even children. People sat around the fire, talking things out. Sometimes all night. Sounds kind of refreshing, doesn't it? Now, power wasn't always about who shouted the loudest. It often came from wisdom, generosity, or even your skill in storytelling or mediation. Leaders had to earn trust and keep it. If they stopped being fair or started acting selfishly, the people could replace them. No election season drama. Just, you're out. Next. One of the best-known examples of this? The Iroquois Confederacy, or as they called themselves, the Haudenosaunee. This was a powerful union of 5, later 6, nations in the Northeast that formed a kind of mega-alliance. Think of it like the original United Nations, but with more face paint and fewer microphones. They had a Grand Council, with representatives from each nation. Major decisions needed consensus, and everyone had a role. And get this, women, specifically clan mothers, held real power. They chose the male chiefs and could remove them if they weren't doing their job. Can you imagine that today? And the influence didn't stop there. Historians believe that this confederacy actually inspired parts of the U.S. Constitution. Yeah. The Founding Fathers took notes. Literally. But not every society was based on councils. Some had strong chiefs, especially among groups that had big cities and military power, like the Mississippians, who built massive earthen mounds in places like Cahokia, that's near modern-day St. Louis, by the way. Cahokia was huge. Bigger than London in the year 1250. It had a central plaza, huge pyramids of earth, neighborhoods, trade routes, and a population in the tens of thousands. Can you believe that? And yet, most people have never heard of it. In places like Cahokia, leadership might have looked more like a king or high priest. Some rulers were seen as semi-divine. Their power came from the spirits, and people followed them not just out of loyalty, but out of spiritual reverence. Still, even in the more centralized societies, leadership was tied to responsibility, not just authority. If the crops failed or enemies invaded, the people expected action, not excuses. Otherwise, out you go. And speaking of enemies, conflict was definitely part of the picture. Not everyone got along. Tribes defended territory, raided enemies, or competed for resources. But warfare wasn't always about wiping each other out. Sometimes it was symbolic, more about bravery, honor, or revenge than total destruction. Some groups even had rules about warfare. You might count coup, touch an enemy with a stick to show courage without killing. Or you'd spare women and children and only target warriors. Kind of like ancient battlefield etiquette. Now, let's shift gears a little. What did peace look like? You might be surprised to learn that diplomacy was a big deal. Nations formed alliances through marriage, shared ceremonies, trade, and shared hunting grounds. Peace pipes weren't just cliches, they were actual tools for negotiation. Tribes would meet at neutral grounds. They'd feast together, perform rituals, exchange gifts, and talk, and talk, and talk until a solution was found. Sometimes, peace lasted generations. Other times? Not so much. But the effort was always there. And speaking of trade, this was no backwoods bartering system. Indigenous trade routes stretched thousands of miles. Copper from the Great Lakes ended up in the southeast. Seashells from the Gulf were found in the Midwest. Obsidian from the Rockies reached the plains. People traveled by foot, by canoe, sometimes by horse, after they got them from the Spanish, that is. Goods weren't just exchanged, they carried stories, rituals, and ideas. It wasn't just commerce. It was connection. Now let's take a peek inside a typical community. You'd see clearly defined roles, but also a lot of flexibility. Sure, there were hunters and gatherers, warriors and weavers. But people jumped in where needed. And they were trained from a young age. Little kids? They learned by doing. Toddlers were already helping gather firewood or sort seeds. By age 10, many could fish, cook, sew, or track animals. You weren't babied. You were trusted. Teenagers took part in coming-of-age ceremonies. These were huge. Sometimes you'd fast, spend days alone in the wilderness, or take part in physical tests. It wasn't just about getting older, it was about earning adulthood, and elders? They were gold. They carried history, wisdom, jokes, songs, and warnings. They weren't shoved into nursing homes. They were the heart of the community. When they spoke, everyone listened. So where does that leave us? Well, in a world that's far more complex, intelligent, and structured than most people imagine when they think of pre-colonial America. Power wasn't just about force, it was about wisdom, balance, and the health of the whole community. You weren't surviving against the system. The system was designed to help you survive, through family, tradition, law, and leadership, and maybe the biggest surprise? So much of this was done without writing. No pens. No paper. No contracts. Just memory. Ceremony. Storytelling. And trust. Can you imagine that level of memory and connection? We're not just talking about surviving anymore, we're talking about governing. About building societies, and these weren't small, scattered groups hiding in the woods, they were nations. Some were nomadic. Others built cities, all of them were powerful, proud, and deeply rooted in this land. But here's the twist, everything was about to change, because just over the horizon, sails were catching wind, and with them came a whole new world of trouble. But before we get there, we're going to take a closer look at how daily life actually felt, how people lived, not just how they ruled. Okay, picture this. You're waking up on a cool morning somewhere on the Great Plains, hundreds of years ago. The grass sways gently. The sun peaks over the horizon. You hear the low hum of voices nearby. Your community is already up, preparing for a day that's not just about survival, but about meaning. Because in this world, everything, yes, everything, has spirit. You see, life in pre-colonial Native America wasn't just about finding food or shelter. It was about understanding the world as one big living thing. The rivers, the rocks, the animals, even the wind, none of them were just background noise. They were alive. They had power. And surviving meant listening to them. Here's what I think is wild. Native people didn't just live in nature. They lived with it. Like, as if they were having an ongoing conversation with the land. Can you imagine walking through the forest and feeling like the trees are watching you, not in a spooky way, but in a sacred way? To survive, tribes didn't rely only on tools or muscles. They relied on a deep connection to the spirit world. That meant paying attention to signs and dreams, the way animals behaved, how the stars moved. Everything was a clue. Everything mattered. Let's take the Plains tribes for example. They held these incredible ceremonies called sun dances. Now, this wasn't your typical dance around a fire kind of thing. It was intense. It was spiritual. People fasted, prayed, and danced for hours, even days, to connect with the Great Spirit, to seek visions, or to bring healing to their people. It wasn't just ritual, it was survival, because healing and guidance kept the tribe strong. So, who led all this spiritual connection stuff? Enter the shamans and medicine men, the spiritual leaders, the healers, the ones who could see things others couldn't. These folks weren't just witch doctors, like old Hollywood movies might make you think. They were doctors, counselors, dream interpreters, and often scientists in their own right. They knew what herbs healed wounds, what chants calmed storms, and what dreams meant when someone saw a wolf made of smoke. Let's say someone got sick. The medicine person wouldn't just treat the body, they'd treat the soul too. Maybe the sickness came from breaking a taboo. Or maybe it was a message from an ancestor. The cure could be a blend of plant medicine and a ritual purification. It sounds mystical, right? But it worked. Tribes had thousands of years to figure out what healed and what didn't, and if you think science and spirit can't mix, think again. Many of their remedies are still used today. Like white willow bark. That's the original aspirin. No kidding. Alright, now let's talk purification, because in a world where the spirit mattered, keeping your spiritual energy clean was just as important as washing your hands. That's where the sweat lodge came in. Picture a small dome made of saplings, covered in hides or blankets. Inside, hot stones were brought in and water poured over them to create steam. But this wasn't a spa day. It was intense. You sat in the dark, sweating like crazy, while prayers were chanted all around you. Why? To cleanse the body, mind, and spirit. To prepare for big decisions or major changes. And then there were vision quests. Imagine being a teenager and told, okay, it's time to go into the woods, fast, and be alone until you have a vision. Sounds terrifying, right? But that's how many young people connected with their spirit guide, learned their place in the tribe, and stepped into adulthood. You'd go out with nothing but maybe a blanket, maybe a drum, and a lot of courage. And you'd wait. No food. No distractions. Just you and the world. Maybe you'd dream of a bear. Or an eagle. Or fire. And when that vision came, it wasn't just a dream. It was your path. Now, here's something really cool. There were no written books. No notepads. No YouTube tutorials, obviously. So how did people pass down survival tips, moral lessons, even jokes? Oral storytelling. And let me tell you, these weren't boring lectures. Stories were full of animals that talked, heroes who transformed into stars, and spirits that could hide in the wind. But behind the fun stuff? Real-life wisdom. For instance, a story about Coyote, the trickster in many tribes, might seem like just a silly tale. But look closer, and it's a lesson about greed, or pride, or why you shouldn't take more than you need. These stories taught kids how to behave, how to think, how to live in harmony with their people and their environment. And guess what? Remembering these stories wasn't optional. It was essential. Because knowing the right story at the right time? That could save your life. So, here's a question for you. Have you ever talked to a tree? Like really talked? In many native traditions, that wasn't weird at all. The tree might not talk back with words, but it had wisdom. You respected it. You asked permission before cutting it down. You offered tobacco, or a prayer, or even just a moment of silence. The same went for animals. If you hunted a deer, you didn't just say, "Thanks, dinner." You gave thanks to its spirit. Maybe you sang a song. Maybe you burned a little sage. Why? Because you weren't just taking meat, you were entering into a sacred exchange. That deer gave its life, and now you owed it respect. Everything was about balance. You give, you receive. You take, you honor. That's how the ecosystem stayed in check, and how your people stayed in harmony with the land. And if you broke that balance, the spirits would notice. The weather might turn against you. Your hunt might fail. Sickness could spread. Survival wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. Now, let's talk taboos. These were more than just bad luck superstitions, they were survival rules wrapped in spiritual clothing. Maybe you were told never to whistle at night. Why? Because it might attract spirits. Or maybe you were taught to never say the name of someone who died. Why? Because their spirit needed peace, not attention. Were these just made-up rules? Maybe. But many had real-world wisdom built in. Whistling at night could scare away animals. Naming the dead might stir up grief too soon. These taboos helped people stay emotionally and physically safe in a wild, unpredictable world. And signs? Oh, people watched everything. The way the birds flew. The shape of the clouds. Dreams. Shadows. Everything had a message. If your dream showed fire and buffalo, that might mean a good hunt. If your baby kept crying after dusk, maybe someone had broken a taboo and needed to make it right. It's not that people were paranoid. It's that they were alert. They paid attention. And in a world without Google or weather apps, that attention was everything. So, if you were living in this world, survival wasn't just about having sharp arrows or knowing where to find food. It was about believing, deeply, in the unseen world. In spirits, in signs, in the sacredness of every rock and river. You had to trust your dreams. Respect the ceremonies. Listen to the elders. And always stay in tune with the forces around you. Because in the time when native people ruled the land, survival wasn't a solo game. It was a dance, with nature, with the spirits, with your community. And speaking of survival, what happens when the weather turns against you? When winter bites or the summer sun dries up everything? Well, get ready, we're heading into the seasons of struggle. You won't believe how people made it through some of the harshest conditions on the continent. So imagine you're waking up one morning in a thick forest near the Great Lakes. It's late November, the sky is gray, the wind is biting, and there's already a crust of snow on the ground. You step outside your lodge, and your eyelashes freeze just from blinking. Now picture this, you have no grocery store, no thermostat, no cozy socks from the mall. And yet, you and your people are getting ready to survive a brutal winter. Pretty wild, right? That's the reality native people faced every single year. Nature wasn't just a backdrop, it was the boss. The seasons weren't something to just enjoy. They shaped everything, what you ate, where you lived, how you dressed, and whether your community thrived or didn't. Winter in the north, yeah, it could be a monster. In places like the Great Lakes or the far northern plains, winters could hit -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow piling up past your knees. Winds sharp enough to make your teeth ache. But native communities didn't just huddle and hope. They prepared. Boy, did they prepare. For months before winter hit, they were drying meat, tanning hides, gathering nuts and berries, and preserving every edible thing they could find. Corn was turned into flour. Wild rice was smoked and stored in bark containers. Fish were smoked over low fires until they were nearly indestructible, and shelters? Oh, they weren't just piles of sticks. Take the Ojibwe, for example. They built wigwams, Those dome-shaped lodges made of birch bark and layered with insulation like moss and animal hides. The design wasn't random. It was practical, wind-resistant, and warm. And when the fire was lit inside, cozy as heck. In the plains, people used earth lodges, kind of like mini hills with doors. Thick walls of packed dirt meant warmth stayed in and cold stayed out. Smart, right? So yeah, native people didn't just survive winter, they engineered their way through it. But even with preparation, winter was no joke. It was a test of endurance, planning, and community. Everyone had a role. Elders told stories to pass the long nights. Hunters checked trap lines. Women mended clothes and rewrapped moccasins. Kids learned by watching, helping, and listening. And when food ran low, people shared. That was non-negotiable. In many native cultures, letting someone go hungry while you had extra was a serious spiritual offense. So survival wasn't just physical, it was social, moral, and deeply communal. Now fast forward to summer in the Southwest. You'd think, hey, at least it's warm, right? Sure. Until it hits 115 Fahrenheit or 46 Celsius, until the rains don't come, until the crops shrivel and the rivers dry up. Tribes like the Hopi and Zuni knew this well. They were dryland farmers, masters of coaxing life from the harshest soil. They planted corn deep, like really deep, so the roots could reach the underground moisture. They used clever stone alignments to catch rare rainwater and direct it to their crops. And when that didn't work, they turned to prayer, to ceremony, to songs passed down for generations that called to the clouds and asked the spirits for mercy. These weren't just spiritual gestures, they were survival strategies. When you live in a world that gives and takes based on wind, water, and sun, you build a relationship with those forces. You respect them. You talk to them, but sometimes, the answer was still no. And then things got scary. Imagine the buffalo don't come. The herd migrates differently. Or worse, they've been hunted out by other groups or, spoiler for later chapters, newcomers. Suddenly, your community's entire protein source is gone. What do you eat? Or let's say the salmon run fails. Tribes in the Northwest, who had entire seasonal rhythms built around the return of the fish, suddenly find their nets empty. No salmon means no winter stores. No trade. No celebrations. In those times, people had to fall back on the old wisdom. Plants that were bitter or hard to cook became lifelines. Squirrels, rabbits, even insects, nothing went to waste. There were stories of emergency caches hidden in the forest or buried food pits that could last years if untouched. Reading the signs became crucial. A red sky at dawn? Trouble. Unusual bird migrations? A warning. Changes in animal behavior or early frosts, these were nature's text messages. And native people had learned to check them daily. So many decisions depended on knowing the land intimately. You had to know when to move your camp, when to hunt, fish, gather, or rest. Timing was everything. And let's not forget, you didn't do this alone. Survival was a team sport. You had scouts, trackers, elders, spiritual leaders, hunters, gatherers, cooks, toolmakers, even kids had jobs. Everyone contributed. Everyone mattered. When something went wrong, maybe a storm wiped out the harvest, or an early freeze caught you off guard, you didn't blame bad luck. You looked for meaning. Had a taboo been broken? Were the spirits angry? Was a dream trying to tell you something? Because in native worldviews, the line between the natural and the spiritual was thin. Weather wasn't just weather. It had a voice, a mood, a reason. So, when hardship came, and it always did, people turned inward and upward. They listened to dreams, consulted the medicine person, held ceremonies, sang songs, and they kept going. You want a picture of real resilience? Look at a grandmother weaving baskets in the middle of a drought. Look at hunters tracking elk through waist-deep snow. Look at a young girl carefully placing stones to catch the morning dew for her family's water. These weren't dramatic Hollywood-style survival moments. No epic music or slow-motion shots. Just quiet, determined, everyday brilliance, and still, with all this preparation and experience, some years were just bad. People died. Hunger came. Cold crept in. And when it did, the community grieved, but they didn't collapse. They told stories. They sang old songs that reminded them who they were. They said prayers to the ancestors, hoping for a better season next time. Because every native culture knew one thing: the land gives, and the land takes. And surviving meant learning to dance with that rhythm. So, next time you step outside and complain about the weather, just imagine doing it all with no heater, no fridge, no phone. Just your people, your instincts, and the land beneath your feet. Still think you could survive? Well, maybe you could. If you listened. If you learned. If you leaned on your community like a second spine. And speaking of the land, we're going to zoom in on something pretty cool. You've seen the survival. Now let's meet the tools. Let's talk obsidian knives, sinew thread, and the genius of turning bone and bark into lifelines. We've already talked about surviving harsh seasons, right? But now let's slow it down and take a closer look at the things, the tools, materials, and clever designs that helped native communities not just survive, but thrive. Because trust me, these weren't just everyday objects. They were sacred, powerful, passed down through generations like precious treasures, and some of them? Genius level smart. Alright, here we go. You're walking through a pine forest. The air smells like sap and smoke. Your cousin's over there carving something with a knife so sharp it could split a hair. The blade? Not steel. Not store-bought. It's obsidian, volcanic glass, so finely chipped it's basically ancient technology with a ninja's edge. No kidding, obsidian blades were sharper than scalpels. Modern scientists have studied them and found they cut tissue cleaner than surgical steel. Can you imagine that? But here's what's wild: native people were crafting these blades without factories or blueprints. Just raw skill, patience, and deep knowledge of stone. They'd find the right rock, usually near old volcanoes in places like the West, and then start a process called flint knapping. Tap here, strike there, over and over, until a deadly, razor-fine edge appeared. And these blades weren't just used for hunting or skinning, they were also for ceremony, for healing, even for war. And they weren't the only tool in the kit. Let's talk sinew. Sounds kinda gross, but stay with me. Sinew is the stringy, fibrous tissue from animal tendons, like the strong cords along a deer's leg. Once cleaned, dried, and soaked, it becomes nature's superglue thread. You could sew clothes with it, tie arrowheads on shafts, bind together sleds and bows. Need to make a fishing net? Use sinew. Stitching up a wound? Yep, sinew again. This stuff was stronger than modern thread and more flexible than most rope. And when it got wet, it tightened. That made it perfect for anything that needed to stay bound under pressure. Honestly, it's kind of amazing how nothing went to waste. Killed a buffalo? You didn't just eat the meat and call it a day, you used the hide for clothing, shelter covers, and drums. The bones became tools, needles, and weapons. The horns turned into spoons or ceremonial rattles. Even the bladder was saved, to hold water, like a natural canteen. Imagine living like that, zero waste. Everything had a purpose. It wasn't about being eco-friendly. It was just life. Respectful, efficient, and rooted in gratitude. Speaking of respect, let's talk birch bark. Oh man, this stuff was the native version of duct tape, lightweight, waterproof, tough. It was used to build canoes so sleek and fast that European fur traders couldn't believe their eyes. These weren't clunky rafts. They were finely crafted vessels, held together with spruce gum and stitched seams, that could carry hundreds of pounds of gear and glide through narrow rivers like magic. And they weren't just transportation. These canoes meant survival, fishing, trading, migrating, escaping danger. And when they wore out, you repaired them. Or you built another with more birch, more gum, more hands working together. Think about how many materials we toss in the trash every day. Now picture a world where every single thing you touched had to be found, made, repaired, and reused. No imports. No plastic. Just your land, your knowledge, and your hands. Makes you look at a twig differently, huh? Now, not everything was practical. Some tools had soul, spiritual meaning layered deep into the wood or stone. Take rattles made from turtle shells. Or drums carved from hollowed logs and stretched hide. These weren't just instruments, they were ways of speaking to the spirit world. Used in healing, in dance, in storytelling. When the drum beat, it wasn't just music. It was a heartbeat. Of the people. Of the earth. And you know what else? These tools carried stories that a flint spearhead might be 100 years old, passed from grandfather to father to son. A necklace made from eagle feathers might represent a rite of passage, a vision quest, a moment of power. Nothing was ever just an object. Everything had a backstory. Everything had meaning. And the knowledge? That was the real treasure. You didn't just pick up a bow and start hunting. Someone, your uncle, your grandmother, your mentor, taught you. Carefully. Repeatedly. You sat beside them while they shaved wood into a bow, steamed it into shape, strung it with twisted sinew. You practiced carving arrowheads until your hands cramped. This wasn't DIY. This was ancestral craftsmanship, refined over generations. And what about clothing? Before there were jackets with zippers and waterproof boots, native people made entire wardrobes out of what they hunted and gathered. In the north, warm tunics made of caribou or buffalo hide. In the southwest, breezy cotton and woven yucca fiber sandals. In the forest, moccasins stitched with porcupine quills and decorated with dyes made from berries and clay. Even that clothing told stories, through color, shape, beadwork. A single shirt could show your clan, your journey, your tribe. Like wearing a biography on your chest. And hey, survival isn't just about staying alive, right? It's about living well, with pride, with purpose. And that means tools that aren't just functional but beautiful. Let's not forget weapons, either, spears tipped with stone. Clubs carved from hardwood. Bows crafted for strength and silence. These weren't mass-produced. Each one was tuned to its owner, height, draw length, strength. A perfect fit. Like a warrior's fingerprint, and even weapons had spirit. Before a hunt or battle, they were blessed. Danced over. Given offerings. Because every strike meant taking a life, animal or human, and that was never taken lightly. See the pattern? Survival tools weren't just gear. They were expressions of respect. To the animal, to the earth, to the ancestors who taught you. Even storage pits, dug carefully into the ground and lined with bark or stone, were protected like treasure chests, because they literally were. Lose that winter food? Your people might starve, break a water container during a drought? Big trouble, misplace your bow before a hunt? Not just embarrassing, dangerous. So people cared for their tools like family. They fixed them, cleaned them, passed them down. And when something finally wore out beyond repair, it was returned to the earth. Not thrown away, but offered. Buried, burned, or laid in a river. Because it had served its purpose, and now it was time for it to rest. And that, maybe more than anything, tells you about native survival. It wasn't just clever. It was sacred. It wasn't just about making do. It was about making with meaning. So next time you pick up something, your phone, your jacket, your backpack, ask yourself, could I make this from scratch? Could I explain how it works? Would I know how to fix it if it broke? And now imagine doing that for everything in your life. It's humbling, right? That's the world native people lived in. And thrived in. With skill, with care, and with tools that connected them to every part of the earth. But what about the people themselves? What was it like to grow up in that world, to be a kid learning all this from scratch? We're going inside the childhoods of native communities. Games, lessons, coming-of-age journeys, and what it took to become a grown-up in a world that didn't give out participation trophies. Now, let's zoom in on something even more personal, childhood. What was it like to grow up back then, when there were no schools, no screens, and definitely no cereal commercials? Well, buckle up. Because growing up in a native world, that was a journey, beautiful, tough, playful, and sometimes downright intense. Kids didn't just play tag and wait for snacks. They were in training. Training to survive, to lead, and to carry on the stories of their people. Let's light the fire and begin. So, picture a young child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, sitting beside a grandmother who's weaving a basket. There's no paper, no crayons, no learn-to-read books. But that child? Their brain is soaking up everything. See, back then, childhood wasn't about being cute. It was about learning. Fast. Because life was unforgiving, and the sooner you could contribute, the better for your community. But don't worry, it wasn't all chores and survival drills. Kids had a blast, too. Just different kinds of fun. Let's start with games. Native children played all kinds, from mimicry games that taught hunting and tracking, to ball games that sharpened teamwork and strength. In the plains, for example, there was a stick game where kids would toss a hoop and try to spear it with a wooden rod while running full speed. Think of it like lacrosse meets javelin. In the Arctic, snow games taught balance and awareness. In the Southwest, clay games and corn kernel counting helped with math and fine motor skills. But here's the cool part, every game had a purpose. Running wasn't just about burning energy, it trained your lungs for hunts, hide and seek. That was stealth practice. Guessing games? Memory drills. Even doll play had layers. Girls often played with dolls dressed in tribal clothing to teach them sewing, social customs, and responsibility. Those dolls weren't plastic or plush, they were made of corn husks, leather, or carved wood. And they weren't just toys, they were teaching tools, and the learning? It didn't come from classrooms. It came from watching, listening, and doing. Elders were the living libraries. You didn't ask, "Can I read a book on this?" You sat quietly and watched someone gut a fish. Or you listened to a story by the fire that sounded like a legend, but was secretly a life lesson in disguise, like this one. A young boy dreams of a giant bear who tells him to follow the wind. He walks alone through mountains and forests and learns to fish, make fire, and find medicine plants. When he returns, he's no longer a boy. He's a man. Sounds like a cool story, right? But it's also teaching kids how to be brave, to observe nature, to trust dreams, and to survive. Now let's talk education, real, raw, everyday learning. By the time you were 7, you were probably learning to start a fire without flint or matches. Tell which plants healed wounds and which ones could kill you. Track animals by their footprints, broken branches, even droppings. Memorize dozens of stories passed down for generations. Respect every part of the natural world, because your life depended on it. Not bad for elementary school, huh? And here's where it gets intense. By around age 12 to 14, childhood began to end. Because that's when the rites of passage kicked in. Now, every tribe had its own way of marking this transition, from child to adult, but the meaning was the same: you are no longer a kid. Now, you carry responsibility. For boys, that might mean a vision quest. Imagine this: you're taken out into the wilderness, alone, with no food, no fire, no company. Just you and the stars. You stay for days, fasting, praying, waiting for a vision, a dream, an animal, a voice. Something that tells you who you are and what path you're meant to walk. Sound intense? It was. But it was also powerful. Because it gave young people a deep sense of identity. You weren't just coming of age. You were being chosen, by spirit, by nature, by the ancestors. Girls had their own sacred rites, often around their first menstruation. In many cultures, this was seen not as a curse, but a great power. Some tribes believed girls at this age held so much energy, they needed to be secluded for a while, not to hide them, but to help them harness their new strength. During this time, older women would teach them how to care for others, how to gather medicinal plants, how to keep traditions alive. Afterward, there might be a feast or a dance to welcome her as a woman. Imagine that instead of a birthday party. And these rites? They weren't just for show. Once you passed them, expectations changed. You helped hunt. Or sew. Or carry water. Or counsel younger kids. You weren't just tagging along anymore, you were part of the tribe's survival. Crazy to think about, right? Now, you might be wondering, what about love, hugs, bedtime stories? Don't worry, that stuff existed too. Native communities were tight. Everyone helped raise kids, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, even older siblings. You didn't grow up with just 1 or 2 people looking out for you. You grew up with a whole village of protectors and teachers. And respect for elders? Huge. You didn't roll your eyes at grandma. You listened, because she carried generations of knowledge in her memory. Forget Google, your elders were your search engine. Every night by the fire, they told stories. And not just for entertainment. These tales had heroes and monsters, yes, but also maps to survival. They warned of greed, praised bravery, explained weather, and encoded morals in every twist and turn. Like the coyote who stole the sun and melted his paws, a reminder not to be too bold without understanding the risks. Or the spider who taught people how to weave, honoring patience and craft. These stories didn't just stick in your head. They stayed in your soul. And then there was the fire. Every tribe had some form of central fire, a literal flame that represented warmth, community, and continuity. Kids learned to sit around it, not just for heat, but for wisdom. You learned when to speak, when to listen, when to laugh, and when to take something deeply to heart. That's why they called themselves children of the fire. Because fire wasn't just fuel. It was tradition. Protection. Spirit. And if you grew up close to it, you carried its warmth into everything you did. Now, did kids ever goof off? Of course. Did they mess up? Absolutely. But every mistake was a lesson. You didn't get grounded or sent to a principal's office. You got taken aside, taught again, and reminded, you are a thread in this great web. Your actions matter. So yeah, being a kid in that world, it was hard sometimes. You had to grow up quick, learn fast, and face things most of us can't even imagine. But it was also magical. You belonged, you were needed, you were seen, not just as a future adult, but as a powerful being, right now, learning to carry a sacred flame. That's what childhood meant back then. That's how you were prepared for the hunts, the ceremonies, the tools, the storms, and, eventually, the world beyond. Speaking of which, what happened when that world suddenly changed? When strangers arrived. When the rules, the tools, the rhythms of daily life were disrupted. So, imagine this: you're sitting by the fire with your family, maybe chewing on dried buffalo meat, listening to your uncle tell an old story about how the stars came to be. The sky is full of constellations, your village is quiet, peaceful, then someone rushes into the camp out of breath and says they saw something strange on the horizon. Something tall, shiny, floating on water. You'd probably squint, right? Maybe even laugh. But then, more people start seeing the same thing. These big wooden canoes, unlike anything anyone's ever built. Pale-skinned people stepping out in weird clothes. Beards that look like moss. Objects that glint in the sun. And they don't speak your language. At all. That was the beginning of something no one saw coming. For a long, long time, the people of the land, across forests, deserts, plains, and rivers, lived without ever knowing about Europe. Or metal armor. Or gunpowder. Or smallpox. But when contact came, oh, it came fast. And things would never be the same. At first, some folks were curious. Who are these strange travelers? What do they want? They came with shiny gifts, glass beads, knives, tools, and these weird boomsticks that made thunder and killed animals from far away. That was impressive. Imagine seeing a musket go off for the first time when the biggest bang you've ever heard before was thunder. Some tribes were welcoming. They saw opportunity. Trade, alliances, maybe even friendship. After all, sharing and hospitality were deeply woven into native cultures. If someone showed up hungry, you fed them. If they looked lost, you helped. But others? They got a bad feeling. And honestly, they weren't wrong. Word started to spread between tribes, across trade routes, riverways, even by smoke signals. Some said the newcomers were friendly. Others warned they were greedy, sneaky, and couldn't be trusted. Confusion reigned. There was no rulebook. No one had ever dealt with anything like this before. And here's something a bit tragic. At first, it wasn't the swords or guns that caused the most harm. It was what the newcomers didn't even know they were carrying: disease. You won't believe this, but one of the first gifts the Europeans gave native people was smallpox. Yeah. Smallpox, measles, influenza, things that didn't exist in the Americas before contact. And because no one's immune systems were ready for them, entire villages were wiped out. Imagine that for a second. You're living your normal life. Then someone in your community gets sick. Then another. Then dozens. And within weeks, your town feels empty. Elders gone. Children gone. Knowledge lost. All because of something invisible. No war. No attack. Just death. Some estimates say diseases killed up to 90% of the native population in certain areas. That's not a typo, 90. It was catastrophic. Now add that on top of cultural confusion. Picture two people trying to trade, but they don't speak the same language. One offers a valuable pelt, the other offers beads. Both smile and nod, thinking they just got the better deal. But in truth, they're both misunderstanding each other's values entirely. Europeans often thought land was something you could own, like, with a deed and a fence. But native people believed land couldn't be owned. It was like trying to own the sky. It belonged to everyone and to no one. So, when Europeans said, "We're buying this land," native people might have thought they were just offering to share it. That caused problems. Big ones. Agreements broke down. Trust shattered. And things turned violent. But here's the thing, it wasn't just Indians versus Europeans. That's way too simple. Some tribes formed alliances with the French. Others with the British. Still others tried to play both sides. Why? To protect themselves. To get ahead. To survive, because in this strange new world, the rules were changing fast. And here's something kinda ironic. While native people were seen as primitive by the Europeans, they had their own sophisticated diplomacy, their own complex governments, and a deep understanding of the land. In fact, the Iroquois Confederacy, yeah, that was a real thing, had a system of governance that inspired parts of the U.S. Constitution. Bet you didn't hear that in school, but the pressure kept building. The deer started disappearing where guns were used too often. Rivers once calm now carried strange cargo. Languages were being lost. Children started hearing new gods' names. The spirit world was being pushed aside. And survival, already hard enough, was turning into something else entirely. In the Southeast, some tribes like the Cherokee tried to adapt. They started wearing European clothes. Learning English. Building homes like colonists. Even creating their own written language. Can you imagine reinventing your whole way of life just to survive? In the North, tribes like the Wampanoag helped early settlers, including those famous Pilgrims. Yeah, that Thanksgiving story. It has a real backstory, and it's way more complicated than what you see in cartoons, but let's not sugarcoat it. The newcomers kept coming. More ships. More settlers. More farms. More fences. The forests started thinning. Sacred sites were bulldozed or built over. Buffalo herds, once numbering in the millions, began to vanish. Salmon runs dried up as rivers were blocked. And those who had once ruled this land with spirit, ceremony, and balance, were now being pushed to the edges. It wasn't just about physical survival anymore. It became about cultural survival. Holding on to language, ceremony, and identity while being told to become civilized or else. So, what do you do when your world is falling apart? When everything you know is under threat, you resist. You adapt. You fight to endure, and that's exactly what many native nations did. Some took up arms. Some took up treaties. Some went underground, preserving their ways in secret, passing stories in whispers, keeping the fire of their culture burning low but steady, because this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. It was a turning point. The old ways of survival, guided by dreams, by the stars, by the land, weren't gone. They just had to find new ways to live, in a world that suddenly felt very unfamiliar. We'll follow that fight to endure. You'll meet warriors, leaders, visionaries, some names you might know, others you'll be glad to meet. Because when survival became resistance, it gave birth to some of the most powerful stories in native history. Okay, quick reality check. By this point in the story, native nations weren't just trying to survive the land anymore, they were trying to survive history itself. Imagine this, your ancestors lived on this land for thousands of years. You know every bend of the river, every season of the animals, every story tied to the rocks and trees. But now, strangers have planted flags. They've built towns. They've drawn maps that don't include you. So what do? Well, you don't just disappear, you adapt, you resist. Let's start with something that really shook things up, the horse. Yep. Horses aren't native to the Americas. But when they arrived with the Spanish in the 1500s, oh boy, everything changed. Some tribes like the Comanche, Lakota, and Crow became absolute masters of horsemanship. Before that, buffalo hunts were on foot with spears. Now, warriors could ride at full gallop, shooting arrows with deadly precision. You could say the horse was like the smartphone of its time, completely game-changing. And it wasn't just about the hunt. Horses transformed warfare, travel, even trade. Suddenly, you could carry more, go farther, strike faster. The Plains tribes, in particular, became fierce and mobile. Think lightning on four legs. Now add in guns. These were traded from Europeans, sometimes stolen, sometimes bought with furs, sometimes demanded in uneasy treaties. Tribes quickly realized they needed firepower if they were going to protect themselves. So, they learned. Fast. But here's what's amazing, despite the chaos, native leaders didn't just react. They strategized. They made alliances. They adapted their battle tactics. They became diplomats, warriors, and survivors on all fronts. Let's talk about one of the legends, Tecumseh. Now this guy wasn't just a warrior, he was a visionary. A Shawnee leader who dreamed of something radical, all native tribes, united as one, to push back against the American settlers. Think about how wild that is. Dozens of tribes, each with different languages, customs, homelands, joining forces. It was like trying to form a government on the go, while being attacked from every side. But Tecumseh believed in it. He traveled thousands of miles on foot, rallying people with fiery speeches and a clear message: we must stand together, or fall apart. His brother, known as the Prophet, was more of a spiritual leader. Together, they built Prophetstown, a place for native renewal and unity. Sadly, it didn't last. The U.S. military destroyed Prophetstown. Tecumseh died in battle in 1813. But his dream? Oh, it still echoes today. Now, let's fast forward to the Southwest. Ever heard of Geronimo? He was an Apache warrior who became a symbol of resistance. This guy led raids and evaded capture over and over again, using the desert like his personal chessboard. He knew every canyon, every hiding spot. U.S. forces couldn't catch him for years. It drove them nuts. Geronimo didn't fight just to win battles, he fought for freedom. For his family. For his way of life. He finally surrendered in 1886, but even then, he never lost that fire. He lived out his days as a prisoner of war, but also as a living legend. And then there's Sitting Bull, the Lakota leader and holy man. Now, here's a man of unshakable dignity. He had visions that guided his people. And when the U.S. government tried to push the Lakota off their lands they were promised in treaties, Sitting Bull stood his ground. You've probably heard of the Battle of Little Bighorn, right? That's where General Custer and his men were defeated in 1876. A rare native victory. A massive one. And Sitting Bull? He was right at the heart of it. But even victories came with consequences. After Little Bighorn, the U.S. government cracked down hard. More troops. More pressure. More betrayal. And slowly, despite the strength and spirit of these leaders, native people were forced onto reservations. Lands far smaller, often less fertile, and completely disconnected from their ancestral homes. But don't think they just rolled over. Even on reservations, people found ways to keep traditions alive. They practiced ceremonies in secret. Taught their kids the old languages. hid sacred objects away from authorities who tried to erase their culture. You see, resistance wasn't always with arrows or rifles. Sometimes, it was in a mother whispering an old song to her child. A grandfather telling stories by the fire. A young girl learning to beat in the patterns of her ancestors. Culture became a form of rebellion. A way to say, we're still here. But let's pause for a second. Can you imagine what it took to survive that time? To adapt to completely new weapons, strange beliefs, and shifting borders, and still keep your identity? It's honestly incredible. Some tribes learned to read and write in English just to fight back in court. Others studied U.S. laws to challenge broken treaties. And a few even sent their kids to schools far away, hoping they'd return with tools to protect the tribe, though that came with its own heartbreak. Because boarding schools? Yeah, they were brutal. Native children were taken from their families. Their hair cut. Names changed. Languages forbidden. The goal was to civilize them, but really, it was to erase them. Still, in the face of that cruelty, kids held on. Sometimes only in dreams. Sometimes in whispers. But the spirit refused to die, and in the middle of all this, Native people still made art. Danced. Sang. Prayed. They still lived. They hunted and farmed and made beauty in places the world thought were broken. That's what resistance looked like too. It wasn't just blood and battles, it was survival through change, and that brings us to today. Because this is an ancient history. It's not over. The echoes of Tecumseh, Geronimo, and Sitting Bull still ripple through Native communities across North America. You can hear it in a powwow drumbeat. See it in a ribbon skirt. Feel it in the proud voice of a young Indigenous leader standing up and saying, "We're still here." Their ancestors didn't vanish. They adapted. They endured, and now, they're thriving in new ways. But before we get there, before we celebrate the legacy and resilience that still lives on, we need to take one last look back. Let's ask, what actually survived? What made it through centuries of storms? Let's walk through the lands, the languages, the hearts still beating with the old rhythm. Let's talk about what endures. Alright, so here's the thing, after everything we've covered, it'd be easy to think the story ends with loss. Land taken. Languages fading. Cultures nearly crushed. But you know what? That's not the end. Not even close, because something incredible happened, and it's still happening. Indigenous peoples didn't vanish. They endured. Their traditions? Still alive. Their languages? Still spoken and even revived. Their stories? Still being told, sometimes in classrooms, sometimes on TikTok, and often around fires, just like before. Let's explore what's still here. What's fighting this day? What's growing again, from the ashes, from the soil, from the echoes in the earth? First off, let's talk about language. Did you know that before European contact, there were over 300 native languages spoken in North America? And that each one wasn't just a way to talk, it was a whole worldview. A way to see the earth, the sky, the animals, yourself. Some of those languages were nearly lost. But today, there's a movement, a big one, to revive them. Kids are learning to speak Mohawk in immersion schools. Navajo is being taught with mobile apps. The Lakota language has full online dictionaries. Some tribes even use virtual reality to teach sacred phrases and greetings to the next generation. Imagine that, an ancient tongue whispered by ancestors now coming to life through headphones and game consoles. And it's not just about talking. It's about remembering who you are. Next up, ceremony and spirituality. Sweat lodges still happen. sun dances are still danced. Elders still guide vision quests and healing rituals. And even though some were banned by the US government for years, yep, seriously, many have returned, stronger than ever. At powwows, these beautiful, public gatherings, you'll see dancers in stunning regalia, hear the drumbeats that echo through generations, and feel the joy of cultures refusing to go quiet. You ever been to a powwow? If not, you should go. It's not just an event, it's a statement. We're still here. Still proud. Still dancing. And let's talk land, now. This one's tough. A lot of native land was taken, broken up, or polluted. But today, some of it's being returned, piece by piece. There are movements to give back sacred mountains, rivers, and forests. Some tribes now manage national parks in partnership with the government. Others run their own wildlife preserves, teaching old ways of hunting, farming, and caring for the land. It's called land back. And while it's just a start, it's a powerful shift in the right direction. Oh, and remember all those tools we talked about? Birch bark canoes, obsidian knives, traditional beadwork? That stuff's still being made. In fact, there's a whole wave of young indigenous artists who blend old skills with new styles. You'll find Instagram pages full of hand-beaded earrings, hand-carved pipes, elk-hide drums, all crafted with traditional care and modern pride. So, survival tools? Yep, still here. Still sacred. Let's not forget the food movement, too. There's a big push among native chefs and farmers to bring back traditional foods, things like bison, wild rice, salmon, squash, blue corn. They call it food sovereignty, the right to grow and eat the way your ancestors did. Imagine a restaurant where every dish is based on pre-contact indigenous ingredients. No wheat, no sugar, no beef. Just the original flavors of the land. That's not a fantasy, it's real. Look up the sous chef or Café Oloni sometime. These are powerful examples of cultural revival served on a plate. And then there's the youth. You'd think after centuries of colonization, forced boarding schools, and broken treaties, native youth would disappear into history books, but no. They're making documentaries. They're studying law, medicine, and language. They're out protesting pipelines and organizing climate strikes. They're dancing powwow style at music festivals. They're teaching their younger cousins how to skin deer or sing in their tribal tongue. They're reclaiming everything, names, land, traditions, and their own futures. And you know what's wild? Some of the most powerful stories come from kids who were told their heritage didn't matter, who then went looking, found it, and lit up like fire. Because when you know where you come from, you walk taller. Let's take a moment and imagine something together. Imagine being born today on a reservation, where unemployment is high, internet is patchy, and housing might be rough. But your grandma still weaves baskets, your uncle still drums on weekends, your community still holds ceremony. And when you go to school, there's a class for your tribal language. And one day, someone asks you, what's your culture? And instead of saying I don't know, you say, I'm Lakota. Or I'm Choctaw. Or I'm Wampanoag. And you know what that means? That's what's happening all across the continent. Even outside reservations, in cities like Minneapolis, Phoenix, and Toronto, there are native community centers, urban powwows, and language circles. Some indigenous folks didn't grow up with strong connections to their heritage, but they're relearning. Reclaiming, the fire didn't go out, it just needed a little breath to spark again. So, let's zoom out. After all the hardship, the storms, the broken promises, the battles, the survival, what do we still have? We have language. We have storied, we have ceremonied, we have land, we have people. Not in museums. Not just in history books, living, breathing, resisting, rising. And now comes the question we've been building to since the beginning of this journey. What would you have needed to survive in their world? Would you have known how to read the clouds, how to heal a fever with tree bark, how to carve a bough or sit still for a vision? Would you have passed your rite of passage? But maybe the better question is, what can we learn from that world, right now? Because let's be honest. Our modern lives are fast, noisy, and often disconnected from the land, from community, from purpose. Maybe it's time we remembered some of the wisdom that kept people alive, happy, and balanced for thousands of years. So here's what I think: if we listen to the echoes, if we learn from the past, if we honor the voices still singing, maybe we don't just preserve history, maybe we heal something, too, and that's a legacy worth carrying.